collaborate, they can kill the mastodon because they can work together, and some people who bring in new ideas who can find the mastodon. And you will form a group like that, and you get the optimal performance by the group. In fact, we think of humans, or I think of humans, as a kind of superorganism. And when I showed you that network animation earlier, when I saw that, I began to think of social networks as living things. I mean, they have things move and flow within them. They change their shape. They're resistant to injury. You take one person dies, and the network continues to exist. They have a purpose and a function. They have a memory. They have a kind of coherence and an endurance across time. They survive. They reproduce. And so I began to think of social networks as a living thing, as a kind of human superorganism. And this collection, a superorganism, is a collection of individuals that's able to act in concert to produce phenomena that are governed by the collective. And examples from the natural world include things like bees finding a nesting site, or birds that are flocking to avoid a predator, or that collaborate to decide where to fly. They can find a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific by pooling their knowledge, or wolves that band together to bring down larger prey, or human beings that assemble ourselves in the most modern way, for instance, in wikis, where we pool our knowledge to create something that's greater than any one of us. And these superorganisms have properties that are not understandable just by studying individuals. Just like you couldn't understand the properties of graphite and diamond by studying carbon or coal, you need to study the collection in order to understand what's really going on. And I think that understanding social networks and how they form and operate can shed light not just on health and emotions that we've been talking about today, but on problems like warfare, crime, political movements, economic phenomena, and so forth. But overall, we form social networks because the benefits of a connected life outweigh the costs. Look, if I was always violent towards you, or gave you bad germs, or made you sad, or gave you misinformation, you would cut the ties to me, and the network would disintegrate. So the flow of good and desirable things is required to sustain and nurture the network. And in turn, the network is required for the flow of good and desirable things, like happiness, or altruism, or love, or ideas. In fact, I think there's a phenomenally deep connection between networks and goodness. I think the reason we form social networks in our lives is precisely so as to create and sustain all kinds of good and desirable properties. Thank you.
Nicholas, that was great. We've got about kind of half an hour for questions, so I'm going to start off with a couple, and then we'll open. I couldn't work out what was going on in our relationship, by the way, in that there were times when you were more of my friend and I was more of yours. I got very confused. I want to start by asking you to make some connections to other ideas that have been discussed on this in this building the last few weeks and longer than that. So the first is we had Robin Dunbar here last week, and he was talking about the Dunbar number, the idea that 150, I think, is the maximum number of friends that we can have. And I asked him about your work, and he said that really that this kind of first-order friend effect it's not for the whole 150, it's for about 60 or 70. That would be, once you get beyond that wouldn't count as your first friend, as it were. So reflect on that.
Okay, so Dunbar's number is this idea that so Robin Dunbar has done this very influential work on what is called the social brain hypothesis, which is the idea that the reason human beings are smart is that we evolved to cope not with environmental complexity, threats of predators or coping with the weather or stuff like that, but rather that we evolved to cope with social complexity. And so as our organizations... Yeah? That's okay.
It's fine. No, join our network.
I think you're back in the room.
I'm back? I'm okay? Excellent. Okay. The reason, so Dunbar argues and others argue that we are smart so as to cope with social complexity. And he develops this very famous plot where he plots the size of our brain by the size of our troops that are formed for different kinds of primates, and he predicts that the size of the troops for humans should be about 150. And the argument here is that we can only cope with knowing whether 150 people intend us ill or well, and we can only track the 150 times 149 divided by 2 relationships. That's a huge number of relationships. And those of you that went to high schools that had small class sizes probably knew everyone in your class, knew whether they liked you or not, and knew something about the relationships between all of them. But if you went to a high school that had 1,000 students in your class, you probably weren't able to do that. And so the reason this is relevant to social networks is that, in one connection, is that I think that one of the reasons for this 3 degrees of influence rule is that when we evolved as one, there are other reasons. I think probably the main reason is that things just decay with distance as you get further and further away from you, like any other wave phenomenon, it decays. But one of the reasons is that when we evolved as a species, we only had troop sizes of about 150. There was no one, and a troop size of 150 has an average distance between any one person and anyone else is about 3 degrees. And so the point is there was no one more than 3 degrees removed from us. Troops of about 150 are just sufficiently small that you can be influenced by or influence people at a certain distance. So Dunbar's number is related to networks insofar as it helps us understand the operation of small social networks, that kind that we evolved to be in.
Great. Can I ask you also about the connection between your work on social networks and Robert Putnam's work on social capital?
Okay.
And in particular, the way in which different kind of networks impact on life chances. Now, in our work, our Connected Communities work, the kind of hypothesis that we have, that we're working on, is that the kind of social networks that maximize opportunity and resilience have certain characteristics. They will have lots of hubs, lots of diverse connections, and lots of what Putnam would call bridging capital, so links out of that network into other networks. Whereas, obviously, the alternative, the opposite, and what we're finding in the multiply deprived communities that we're in is a very different pattern, which is to say very few hubs, very few peripheral links, and very few bridges outside. How does that kind of fit with your work?
So Putnam is very interested in the kind of social capital in particular that has to do with and is sustained by formal organizations, institutions, community groups, the state, non-governmental organizations, and the like. What I'm interested in is a kind of social capital, as I've described, that arises as a result of the interaction between people. And if I might digress for a moment, so what is capital? Capital is, we usually think of it as a stock of resources. But there are 2 other ways to think about capital. One is that it requires skill and effort to accumulate capital. And second, that capital is when you take a substance and rework it to make it more productive than it was before. Like you clear the land with skill and effort to make a farm. Or you take a tree and you mill it to make lumber, and now the lumber is a reservoir of wealth that can do things that the tree could not do, like make a violin, which requires more skill and effort, and now you can do things with a violin that you couldn't do with a lumber, like make music. And so this is one of the ways we can understand capital. And in the 1960s, people began to think about human capital. I can invest skill and effort in someone who's a drunkard, teach them not to drink, they become more productive, I've changed their brain, I've introduced a change in the material substance. Then I can give them an education, and they're educated and have skills, and now they're even more productive. Social capital is like that. We can take human beings, invest skill and effort, and manipulate the interaction between them, or the pattern of ties between them, or naturally create it, and it now makes the group have properties that weren't present before, and makes the group able to do things. And that's how I think about social capital. Now, it's true in the Putnam sense, you can take, formal institutions can foster that kind of social capital. And what he would call bridging capital, I would call, these kind of ties, a pattern of ties that exist between individuals that arise out of the social network. Now, I should say that I'm not as pessimistic, perhaps, as Bob about the variation across human groups, stratified by income or anything else, in terms of social networks, because all human beings form social ties. In fact, the Grameen Bank, Muhammad Yunus, he finds that the most indigent people have social relationships. And in fact, the insight behind the Grameen Bank was that you could collateralize, you could monetize those social ties. Everyone has friends. You get your friends to guarantee the loan. And then you make microloans to these very indigent people. So what I would argue is that everyone has social relationships. Everyone has ties. I don't deny that some of us are better situated than others. But as I showed you, it's not always obvious what's best. So for instance, if you're trying to get information about how to find a job, it's best to be in the middle or to get gossip. But if you're trying to avoid a germ, it's not best to be in the middle. It's best to be on the edge. So there's a deep connection between the ideas, but they don't, there's not like a one-to-one mapping between the